to Alyssa Jean's Reviews, and this is my review for Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, Season 1. This video will be full of spoilers if you have not seen up through the end of Season 1 of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. I haven't covered this show on my channel. I've mentioned it here and there in other videos, but this is my first review, so I just want to kind of share my thoughts on this first season. Now, when I have mentioned it before, I mentioned it before in my House of Dragon review because it's really difficult to not, in fact impossible to not compare the two shows, both of them being major fantasy television shows from pretty major franchises running at the same time. Now, George R. R. Martin did a blog post last week in which he said he rejected the notion that Lord of the Rings and House of Dragon were competing against each other because he's a huge fan of fantasy and fantasy on television in particular, and he wants it all to be successful. He wants more of it, and he wants it all to be good, and I completely agree. I came in to both of these seasons wanting both of them to be successful, but also wanting both of them to be good and wanting to get personal enjoyment from both of them. But whether or not there is a competition between the two of them, there is no possible way to avoid comparing them when they run simultaneously. And when you do that, it is hard not to notice that House of the Dragon is so vastly superior. Now, I mean, not everybody thinks that. There are, I know Rob from Smirking Reviews had a little bit of a different opinion. There's going to be people with different opinions. I do think most people probably feel that House of the Dragon is better. But regardless, I'm not here to talk about other people's opinions. I'm here to talk about mine, and that is how I see it from my point of view. And I mentioned this in my House of the Dragon review that both shows are really just setting up for future events. That's what their first seasons are meant for. House of the Dragon, if you are familiar with the source material, you know where this is all leading to. And you will know that this is just really setting the stage for the main event, which hasn't even really started yet. So it's all setting up for future seasons, the entire first season of House of Dragon. Same with Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. We didn't even get any Rings of Power until the last episode, which shows you that the whole first season is setting up for future events. Now, with that said, House of the Dragon is much better set up. Now, just being a setup season is not automatically a bad thing. If you do it well, then it can still be engaging. You can still be involved in the characters, still involved in the story. And House of the Dragon was successful in that for the most part. You look at the last episode, not to get too spoilery if you haven't seen the show, but you have the whole question of succession with the Valerians, and which is, all of that is really just setting up for what is about to come, and yet you're just enthralled and engaged and just hanging on the edge of your seat for every moment of that setup. Lord of the Rings, not so much. Now, that's not to say that Lord of the Rings was never engaging or never had you feeling involved with the characters. I would just say it was very inconsistent with that. Also, it took a pretty long time to get to the point where I think most of us were feeling engaged and involved, although your mileage will vary. For me personally, I was involved immediately with Galadriel because it's a character I'm familiar with, and this actress is knocking it out of the park, so I was really involved in her storyline right from the get-go. Elrond I was having a harder time with because I was having a hard time reconciling this new actor with Hugo Weaving. They just didn't seem like the same dude, whereas this woman playing Galadriel I could buy, so I was able to latch on to her pretty much immediately. All the rest of the characters, though, took a while to really get invested in them, and then it was just very choppy, very inconsistent. The pacing was very uneven throughout the various storylines, so I'll get into more detail on that. Let's go ahead and dive in. I'm gonna go through very quickly as I can each of the storylines that I'd like to talk about, or each of the characters and the storyline that is around them. So let me go ahead and start with that, and then I'll give my rating out of 10 for this season at the end of this video. Let's start with Galadriel, because I was invested in her from the beginning, as I said. And I should also mention, I am not a canon hawk. I do not care if it adheres word for word to Tolkien's original texts. And I don't think that, like, you know, Tolkien is turning over in his grave or any of that nonsense. Who cares? He doesn't care. He's dead. and who cares? I think as long as they adapt the source material well and tell a good story, I really don't care. So I should mention that. So with that said, I loved Galadriel's backstory in the beginning. I do kind of think about whether we needed all of that, or whether some of that could have been in a prologue like the beginning of Lord of the Rings. It's hard to say. The one thing that I will say about her story, even if she was the character that I most immediately felt involved with, is that her storyline was very uneven. It was spinning its wheels for a while she was in Numenor. And I saw a review of, I think, episode 6, where the person mentioned that it seemed as if they really needed a Galadriel storyline to come together with the Southland storyline with Bronwyn and Theo and all those people by episode 6, but there was a lot more ground that needed to be covered with that other storyline, with those other characters, before they could reach episode 6, where there was a lot fewer ground to cover with Galadriel. So that is why we get training sequences in Numenor, and we get a lot of filler, quite frankly, and it really felt like her storyline was spinning its wheels for a little while until we get to that clash of the two storylines in episode 6. And that's what I mean by uneven pacing. I think that there was just a lot of that in this show. Now, for me, episode 6 is probably still my favorite of the season, where you did have those two storylines come together. And if you're going to compare it to Game of Thrones battles episodes, because, you know, it's a battle episode where the whole thing is about that one storyline. If you're going to compare it to that, it's probably going to fall short. I personally wasn't. I was comparing it to the other episodes in Lord of the Rings, because I compare the show to itself as much as I am comparing it to... I did say I'm comparing it to House of the Dragon, which is kind of hard not to do because it's running simultaneously with it. But as far as each individual episode, like... I don't know. I just didn't think of Game of Thrones. Like, that show was on a few years ago. I was more thinking of, oh, this is the best episode because this is better than all the other episodes that came before that. And then we have a very interesting ending for Galadriel, as she discovers that this man that she was helping all this time and trying to prop up as the king of the Southlands is actually the very person that she had been seeking this whole time, and kind of sweeps it under the rug. She's like, yeah, so Halbrand, yeah, let's not engage with him anymore. You know, let's just kind of, you know, let him do his own thing. Like, but she didn't want to admit that she had been helping Sauron that whole time, and I found that very, very fascinating for this character. Now, as for Halbrand, since we're talking about this, I thought it was pretty apparent pretty early on that he was almost certainly Sauron. I mean, I wasn't 100% sure, but it seemed like the most likely outcome, especially when he told, what's the dude? Alador, the evil dude. He told him, do you remember me? He's like, no. And that dude had mentioned that he had killed Sauron, or at least he thought he had killed Sauron, so that was suspicious. There's just a lot of hints all throughout. I've done evil things before, and Galadriel was like, oh, no, don't worry about the evil things you did before. It was a twist that wasn't shocking, but it was a twist that was well established all throughout the season and well written. It's one of the portions of the show that I think was best written. So that ended up with those two characters. We ended in a really good place, though I still think that the whole Numenor thing dragged on for way too long, and that speaks to the uneven pacing of the show overall. Alright, so I'm actually not going to get too deep into the Southlands characters that we were following. I will say that it did take me a little bit to get interested in these characters. Once I kind of saw where this was headed and that they would eventually collide with Galadriel and the Numenorians, then I became invested in that storyline. I will say that we didn't see them in the final episode. I mean, you can't squeeze everyone into the final episode. So what Theo does next, and his mom, Bronwyn, and where the hell's Ilsandor? Even though technically he's from Numenor, he's kind of crossed over into that storyline. They're pretending like he's dead, which is ridiculous because we saw the prologue of the Lord of the Rings movies and you read the books, you know he's perfectly alive. So that death fake out was weird. But anyway, that's kind of all I had to say about that. It took a little bit, but eventually I was into these characters. I want to kind of shift focus over to Elrond, and as I said, it took a little bit to get kind of into him, and I think where I really started becoming engaged is once he started interacting with the dwarves. I think this was, for a little while, for the middle part of the season, probably the most interesting storyline. I think at the end of the season, not as much, because then the dwarves go away, and they're not even in the finale, so it's, again, uneven. But in the middle part of the season, the interactions between Elrond and the dwarves were entertaining, they were engaging, and I was really into it, even though I didn't quite understand where this the thing with Mithril was building up to, because the show's called The Rings of Power, not the Mithril of Power. I mean, it can't just be about the armor that Bilbo is wearing, and then later Frodo wears. It can't just be about that. So I wasn't quite sure where we were heading with this, and yet I was still very much engaged, involved. And then in the finale, when we finally get to the Rings of Power and we see how Elrond is involved in it, it all comes together and all makes sense. So his storyline, a little rough, a little uneven, but also like Galadriel's and Halbrand's, I liked it. In the end, I was satisfied with that. Now, I'd like to talk about the Harfoots, because this is a storyline for me personally that I was really engaged with from the beginning, and I heard quite the opposite from other people. More than one person said at the beginning of the season, at least, that they did not like the Harfoot storyline. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm pre-programmed to like anything Hobbit related and just find them endearing just automatically. But I too did find our two main characters as kind of being the predecessor to Frodo and Sam, the female versions, like thousands of years earlier. And I did find myself invested, and I found it interesting that they were these travelers, these nomads, because certainly we see that eventually they will settle in the Shire. And I don't know if it's within the realm of the show. By season 2, they're going to be in the Shire. I feel like it should be a lot later, but it doesn't matter to me, whatever. But I was very much invested, and I was very much invested with Meteor Man or the Stranger. Here's my thing, though. We had a twist with Halbrand that was predictable, but it worked well. This one, also very predictable. I mean, I knew very early on that this is so obviously a wizard. Didn't necessarily know that it was Gandalf per se, and it is Gandalf. I will get to that in just a minute. But I knew it had to be some kind of wizard, regardless of what age the wizard supposedly came in the books, or it doesn't matter. It was so obvious that it was a wizard. And while the Halbrand twist, I think, did work, despite the fact that you knew about it already, that it was very predictable, this one didn't work as well for me. This one made me question why it was a twist. Like, why not just say it's a wizard from... It's so obvious that it... I mean, he's doing, like, wizard chants. It sounds a lot like the chants that Gandalf does in the film, in the films, and in the books. There's no way it wasn't a wizard. Like, it just felt like they were insulting my intelligence, especially having two such twists in the same show. I think there's room for one. I think there's room for the Halbrand one. I think they should have just flat out said from the beginning that this was a wizard. And I don't mind them keeping it ambiguous that it's Gandalf, even though it is so Gandalf. I mean, he said, "Follow your nose." That's a line that Gandalf said in the Fellowship of the Ring movie. It's the same exact line, and he's friends with hobbits. Some other wizard just happens to be friends with hobbits and says the same exact line. And of course this is Gandalf. I'm a little less bothered by keeping that ambiguous. If you want to keep it ambiguous, fine. Although, frankly, I don't see why you don't just say it's Gandalf either, since it is definitely Gandalf. They're trying to keep the, Tolkien purist at bay, who would say, no, Gandalf wasn't there yet. This is ridiculous. You're going to have to deal with those people sooner or later. So why not now? Why not just put all your cards on the table and just say that it's Gandalf? But as I said, I'm less bothered by them keeping that piece of it ambiguous if they want to, than I am with this whole secret of who is this guy who is so obviously a wizard. I mean, you may as well just had him wear a freaking Gandalf hat. I mean, come on! With that said, I don't know that I loved the misdirect either, that it was Sauron. Although, I will say I also wasn't 100% convinced that it wasn't Sauron, because I did not have faith enough in these showrunners and this show and these writers that they wouldn't do something so terrible as setting it up the whole season as if it's a wizard and they're going, just kidding, it's Sauron. Like, that would have been terrible. And I didn't trust these writers enough and these showrunners enough that they wouldn't do something that horrible. So there was part of me that was like, oh my god, what if that really is Sauron? And that would just be so bad, because they've been setting up for him to be a wizard this whole time. But thankfully, the show is better than that. They didn't go that way. But still, I don't know that the misdirect was necessary, especially when Halbrand was so obviously Sauron. So obviously Sauron was Halbrand. So I don't know. A little rough around the edges with that stuff. Although, ultimately, I do adore the ending where the two of them go off together, and he does say the Gandalf line of "follow your nose," and it's so obviously Gandalf, but Gandalf with a hobbit. I don't care that Gandalf wasn't supposed to be around, so I guess he's going to go to Rune, where they might encounter other wizards there. So yeah, we'll see where that heads. I'm interested in that, and maybe it ends with them kind of not interacting with anybody else for a long time, and that's why we think that there's no wizards in the Second Age, because they were kind of hidden. Which is also fine, but I don't care either way. Anyways, that's kind of how I feel about that storyline. Okay, there's so much more to talk about because it's a full season and that I have not covered until now, but I think now's a good time to sort of wrap things up. And let me give you my overall rating out of 10 for Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power Season 1, and my rating out of 10, with 1 being the lowest possible score and 10 being the highest possible score, is a 7. 7 is the rating that I give for solid episodes or solid seasons. It's equivalent to 70% or a C-. It's solid. There's a lot to like there. I think there's a lot to build on for a season 2, that hopefully they can be a little more even-handed. And now that they've gotten their 2 twists out of the way, maybe we can move beyond the twists and kind of just really focus in on the story and the characters. So while I think this was not the best setup, I don't think it was set up that it was as good as House of the Dragons. season 1 setup. But I do think now that we're beyond this, there's certainly potential for us to have a much better season 2. So with all of that in mind, this is a solid 7 out of 10. All right, thank you so much for joining me here. Please subscribe. Check out all of my Star Trek content as well as MCU stuff. I'm also reviewing She-Hulk today, so please check out all of that, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.